thank you all for coming. President Hennessy and Robert Harrison are tough acts to follow, so I thought I would do something completely different today. When I started working on medieval literature back in 1992, scholars were still working primarily with editions, edited and cleaned up print versions of texts. Many of the editions went back to the 19th century, when it was common practice to combine versions of texts from different medieval manuscripts in order to come up with a standard version that scholars deemed free of what they called contamination. However, what hooked me on medieval studies was my fascination with the medieval documents, or with the material documents rather, themselves. Their feel, their smell, their creaking bindings, the specific and idiosyncratic redactions of texts they contain, and the marks of use on their pages. Fast forward 22 years, and it's no longer unusual to work with manuscripts. Particularly digital resources have made them accessible and have thus made it possible for scholars to work with medieval texts without recourse to a printed edition. This accessibility causes some problems having to do with citation that I won't go into here, but it does mean that we're moving away from the critical edition, which often contains a text that doesn't actually exist in any medieval document. Viewing the manuscript is not just important for accessing actual medieval versions of texts, but also for seeing how texts are staged, how they are presented. Medieval manuscripts are often described as performative. That is, their materiality, their presence in space and time contribute to their meaning and to the meaning of the texts and images that they contain. Manuscripts spoke to the medieval imagination, and they can speak to us as well. The size, format, quality, illustration, and design of manuscripts offer us an interpretation of the texts that they frame, and the variability of these aspects of presentation are evidence for how very different the medieval approach to books was to our own. Manuscripts can make texts come alive, turn songs into poems, make romances into reference works, subvert the texts they contain, or provide comic relief, to name just a few examples. Whether I'm examining texts or images in manuscripts or both, what drives my work are the questions that arise from the material book itself, the mise en page, the formatting, illustrations, the selection of texts in a compilation, the aesthetic qualities of a text in light of its material context, and so on. And I'm particularly interested in placing manuscripts in medieval discourses that pertain to the composition and transmission of their texts and the compilation of a specific codex. Today, to give you a taste of how I think about literature, I'd like to examine with you a series of manuscript illustrations from the perspective of medieval ideas about seeing. The manuscripts I'll show you were the focus of my recent book, A Courtier's Mirror, but the ideas I'm going to present are something I've been thinking through more recently. In this marginal illustration from 1256, we see a courtly lady dressed in a gown that gathers in folds at her feet. There is no baseline, no background, and no frame. The long, colorful gown tells us that she is of aristocratic status. She's split horizontally into 4 parts, labeled love, sorrow, yes, and no. The blue, green, and red of her gown underline this division into parts. The label above her head reads Unstetigkeit, a feminine abstract noun meaning inconstancy. The figure gestures toward herself and the text while gazing directly out of the page at us, the viewers, as if to say, "Here I stand, inconstancy herself, beware." Particularly striking is her frontal gaze. Her eyes meet those of the viewer directly. The frontal pose is unusual and significant in 13th century illustration, and particularly in this manuscript, and I'll return to it in a moment. This is one of about 100 images that belong to an image cycle accompanying the oldest didactic treatise in German, the Welsche Gast. The title means the Italian guest. The Welsche Gast was composed in 1215 for a secular court audience. It is a 14,000-line poem written in somewhat clunky Middle High German by an Italian native speaker, an Italian cleric, named Thomasin, who was so appalled at the behavior he saw at the German-speaking courts that he was compelled to compose this poem as a guide to proper aristocratic behavior. The Germans were easy to poke fun at even then. Although the poem is a far cry from the literary virtuosity of Parzival or Tristan, it is a critical text for our understanding of medieval court culture. The book covers everything a medieval courtier would need to know: how to raise courtly children, table manners, comportment, courtship, how to give and receive gifts, an abridged description of the 7 liberal arts, an introduction to cosmology, how to live a secular life in accordance with God, and many other nuggets of wisdom. There are 14 illustrated manuscripts of the Vajagast that range in date from 1256 to 1500, all from the southern German-speaking area. This is an unusually rich corpus of material because it is rare to find medieval secular texts that are, first of all, explicitly conceived and designed as illustrated books from the start, and second, that are transmitted over so many years with a specific image cycle. Over the course of 250 years, the text remains stable, but the formatting is quite fluid, and as you can see here, the images are too. This is the same image of inconstancy in 7 different manuscripts spanning from 1256 to the second half of the 15th century. It is in the illustrations and textual apparatus and not the text that the artists have responded to a changing readership. What I'm interested in this series of illustrated manuscripts is how the images vary over time and what this variation means for medieval readership. On the right is a version of inconstancy from the first half of the 15th century. It is rendered so differently from the 1256 manuscript that if the 2 figures were not inscribed and did not appear next to the same textual passage, it would be impossible to identify them as the same image. How can we explain these 2 radically different versions of the figure? After all, the artists used sources and copied the images from manuscript to manuscript, so someone made a radical decision at some point between 1256 and 1400. One way in which I'm interested in approaching this manuscript variation is by considering medieval debates about seeing and the perception of images, and that's what I'm going to do today. The Middle Ages privileged sight and visual perception over other forms of reception and cognition, and this gave rise to numerous discourses on visuality that appear in the works of medieval secular poets, theologians, and scholastics. This emphasis on visuality is highlighted in secular literature in the descriptions of ritual and courtly culture, and the development of literary plots and narrative that rely on seeing and misperceiving visual cues. It is also apparent in the pictorial versions of romances and heroic epics that appear on many objects, from little ivory boxes to mirror casings to wall frescoes, and in the proliferation of manuscript illustration. With regard to images, it was thought that, analogous to exempla, images could act upon the viewer, inducing the acceptance or repudiation of a positive or negative model. Images were perceived as 3-dimensional bodies that invoked the senses of seeing and touch and stimulated an effective response in their viewers. One aspect of reading to keep in mind when viewing a medieval book is this idea that images have power and presence. The illustrations in the Vajagast depict figures enacting models of behavior described in the text, both positive and negative. It is a didactic text, and the images are intended to illustrate its instruction, induce appropriate behavior, and help to instill important knowledge in their viewers. All of the illustrations mutate over time. At the very least, the figure's clothing is changed in accordance with current fashion. But some of the images are altered dramatically, with the result that each manuscript redaction forms new connections between the poem and the audience, whose interests, expectations, and cultural circumstances transmuted over time. This image appears in the 2nd chapter, which deals with lordship. It corresponds to a passage warning lords not to be inconstant because "Sois ganz muss sin eine,
Unstetigkeit, die ist gemeine, wann sie allen haben will, sie ist nicht ganz und hat nicht Ziel, sie ist in 4 Teil geleit, ein Teil ist Liebe, das andere Leid, das dritte ja, das vierte nicht, sie ist zerbrochen und zerbricht. That which is whole, namely governance or lordship, must be unified. Inconstancy is not unified because she wishes to be everywhere at once. She's not whole and has no goal. She's divided into 4 parts. One is love, the other sorrow, the third yes, the fourth no. She is broken and she is destructive. The 1256 illustration is a close visual interpretation of the text. In fact, it seems almost redundant because it so closely reproduces the poem. Scholars initially thought that these images were for illiterate audiences, but it is apparent that most of the illustrations cannot be understood without recourse to the text. It is much more likely that inconstancy functions as a mnemonic image to be contemplated in conjunction with the text and committed to memory. And this is another way in which medieval people saw images, as memory aids. There are many medieval treatises and discussions of the memory arts, and a large body of scholarship to go with it that I won't go into here in detail. Suffice it to say that this personification of inconstancy is designed within this tradition of the memory arts. Her division into contradictory parts in the poem is given structure in the image by the words inserted between the figure's head, torso, hips, and legs, and the different colors used for her gown. Structure is key for the arts of memory because it allows the viewer to imprint items in the mind's eye in an organized spatial manner to later be retrieved. Mnemonic systems often made use of architectural and corporeal structures to organize material. The figure's division into 4 parts is also significant in that it presages the contrast that Thomasine later draws between man's inconstant nature and divine constancy that is manifest in the 4 seasons and the 4 elements. Thomasine's notion of constancy encompasses the divine orderliness of the natural world in which the number 4 plays an important role. The figure's division into 4 parts thus has broader significance both for the poem and for the medieval imagination, and this also helps to make it more memorable. According to the medieval arts of memory, in order to be effective and to impress themselves on the mind's eye, mnemonic images had to be as vivid as possible. This vividness might be achieved through exceptional beauty, repulsiveness, or eccentricity. Here, the image is striking because of its stark color, its division into parts, and its frontal gaze. The frontal gaze is used sparingly and to great effect in the image cycle of this manuscript. Only 3 of about 180 figures gaze directly out of the page at the viewer. All of the other figures are shown in the more common 3/4 profile. Just as an example, here's an image that provides us with a memorable and useful lesson that anything with the capacity to make you very happy also has the potential to make you miserable. A man who is happy to have found a wife in this image becomes distraught when he spies her meeting her lover. She, in turn, is pleased to have her lover, but her infidelity becomes the source of her misery. Here, all of the figures are depicted in profile. This is the most common style of representation. Classicist Jasch Elsner has distinguished between the frontal gaze of cult icons and naturalistic images in which figures, quote, look away, involved in their own worlds, their own narratives and realities. The averted gazes of such naturalistic images elicit a series of identifications, objectifications, narratives from us as viewers to read our way into the picture, as it were, end quote. The arresting frontal gaze of the cult icon, by contrast, is understood by the viewer in the context of liturgical and ritual custom, and therefore has a power that extends beyond a viewer's voyeuristic intrusion. The 1256 figure of inconstancy invokes association with religious cult icons as Elsner describes them. In this image, inconstancy's gaze implicates the viewer and heightens the performative and effective nature of the viewing experience. Her eyes confront and challenge the viewer, resisting any attempt to regard her with the distanced and superior gaze of the voyeur. The viewer is implicated because the frontal gaze meets her own. The image looks at the viewer, just as the viewer looks at the image. The figure's gaze thus detracts from the viewer's autonomy and agency, making the viewer the object of inconstancy's stare.
This image of inconstancy derives its significance, its effect, through its apperception, and the viewer's contemplation of it. The viewer must invest the image with meaning, with the help of the text and with other knowledge that she brings with her. In order to function properly and become impressed on the mind's eye, this image demands the viewer's engagement and agency. This speaks to a particular model of vision. In the course of the Middle Ages, a fundamental shift occurred in notions pertaining to how seeing functioned and the direction in which vision transpired. This was the shift from the extramission to the intermission model. This slide just shows a medieval visualization of the connection between the eyes, nose, and brain up on the left, and then three somewhat competing theories of vision from the 16th century that many of you are probably familiar with. The only reasonable image of extramission I could find was this one, not medieval. According to the theory of extramission, the eye emits a visual ray. This ray, strengthened by the presence of light, goes out to encounter its visual object. It is shaped by that object and finally returns to the eye. These visual rays were conceived as physical entities. In extramission, vision is an active, conscious, and motivated act, and it involves direct physical contact between the subject and object of vision. As such, as Michael Camille has pointed out, the operation and impact of the rays are rather like aspects of certain modern theories. One striking similarity is the recurrence in Lacan's and Sartre's theories of the gaze that are constructive and constitutive of reality, not simply a source of objective sensory input. According to extramission, the viewer actively constituted the image in her mind's eye based on the knowledge she brought to bear on the visual stimuli she saw. Agency and imagination were therefore crucial to apperception. The theory of intromission, by contrast, proposed that rays entered the eye from the object. The image, which exists in the real and natural world outside the mind's eye, acts on the receptive viewer. In either case, the viewer was concretely connected to the image through the rays that enabled sight. The distinction lies in the relationship of the viewer to the image and the status of the image in the real world. In extramission, the viewer actively seeks and constructs the image that enters the mind's eye. In intromission, the viewer's relationship to the image is one of a passive receptor of visual stimuli. As much as I would like to, it is not possible to neatly map a transition in dominant models of vision onto changing styles of illustration, although some have tried. And by the way, I'm speaking here from the perspective of the northern and Western European tradition. The situation in Arabic literature must have been quite different because the development and reception of these models in the Arabic tradition is distinct. So first, the debate in North and Western Europe about the physiological, psychological, and philosophical processes of seeing was complex, heterogeneous, and not limited to a discussion of two discrete and clearly defined vision models. Although the notion of sight as an intromissive process generally superseded the earlier idea of extramission by the 15th century, it is a given that different models of vision coexisted and intersected for centuries. Some people still believe in it. In the Middle Ages, there was no single correct and dominant theory of vision, but rather multiple competing theories that could be used to describe or problematize practices of seeing. Second, the complex debate surrounding models of vision was intellectually exclusive and elitist. It is unclear how much an artist given the task of illustrating the Vieux Auguste in the 13th century would have known about these debates. These theories might have filtered down through texts or conversations to a wider audience, in which case illustrators might have been exposed to partial, overly simplified, or even correct ideas about vision, or incorrect ideas about vision. Nonetheless, these models of vision under discussion in the Middle Ages are informative as they provide a context for considering what kind of reception the images artists may have had in mind when creating them and what issues were up for debate with regard to seeing. Namely, how active was the viewer? Should images represent objects that exist in the natural world, or should they be designed to be constituted in the mind? Was seeing an objective or subjective process, or both? How might an artist most effectively enable a viewer to comprehend, reflect on, and remember the instructions in this and other books of edification? I view the variation in this image cycle within the context of this broader discussion of apperception. To my mind, the changes in the image cycle are evidence for artist participation in a discourse on vision, perception, and imagination, however unconscious that participation might have been. The artist of the 15th century image on the right has rejected most of the striking features of inconstancy as she appeared in the earlier manuscript of 1256. We see a fashionably dressed male courtier pointing toward the text. The figure appears to be a representative of the elite society for whom this text was composed. The significance of this version of the image appears to, however, to lie less in its unremarkable appearance and more in its indexical function that helps to organize the text and points the viewer to a specific labeled section. The inscribed image helps the viewer navigate the poem. The inscription here reads unstätte, inconstant, an adjectival form rather than an abstract noun, supporting the idea that this figure is not supposed to be a personification. In a roughly contemporaneous manuscript from 1420, we see a similar figure of a male courtier, but the label has disappeared completely. In its place, the figure holds a banderole that reads mit Unstetigkeit, with inconstancy. Throughout the image cycle, banderoles are used in a manner similar to speech balloons, and this inscription too may be interpreted as an utterance by the figure pointing to the examples of inconstancy described in the poem. The complete redesign of this image in these two younger manuscripts suggests that the older image was no longer considered effective, that audience expectations had changed, and that the artist felt it necessary to redesign it entirely in order for the images to fulfill their didactic purpose. Allegorical imagery abounds in the 15th century, and the memory arts are alive and well, but the model of seeing presumed for these two images on the right is a different one from 1256. These are not contemplative images to be committed to memory. The youngest versions of the image complicate what we might otherwise be tempted to identify as a shift from extramission to intermission. A Heidelberg manuscript from 1460 depicts the figure as a courtly lady. The words sorrow and love are inscribed on her gown and indicate the duplicity inherent in the vice of inconstancy without literally reproducing the description in the poem. The figure is not divided, and yes and no are missing. She challenges the viewer by gazing directly out of the page while pointing away from the textual passage that describes her. The grass beneath her feet naturalizes the figure, placing her in a real-world context, sort of, rather than presenting her as a memory or internal image floating in space. But is she the source of inconstancy or its victim? Is she a personification of the vice, or is she a lady enacting it? It's not really clear. This is my final and youngest example. It's from the second half of the 15th century. The artist has adopted the image of the divided lady, but has made important changes. The lady's division into competing parts is suggested by the contrasting yellow stripes of her red gown. As in the oldest version, the contradictory terms are included in the image, but they appear adjacent to the figure. Ja, nicht, Leid, lieb. Yes, no, sorrow, love. She is not identified as a personification. She has no label at all. But she holds a banderole with the words, Der Unstätte bin ich kommen in Schmerzen. I have escaped from inconstancy, in pain. Instead of challenging the viewer, she averts her eyes and turns away from the text. Because she does not meet and return the viewer's gaze, she becomes the passive object of the viewer's probing inspection. The viewer is invited to examine the figure unchallenged. Is it possible to detect in this variation a shift from extramission to intermission? We cannot answer this conclusively, but certainly the changes in the image alter the role of the viewer. Through the banderole, the artist has attempted to create a story in which the young lady is not herself inconstancy, but a victim of it. The image no longer makes much sense with respect to the passage that it illustrates, but it tells a story of its own, a story of pain and suffering with which a viewer could identify, or at least empathize. While we cannot presuppose that the artist of this image understood the physics or physiology of the intromission model, it is apparent that he was working with a notion of a viewer who could identify with the figure and would attempt to place it in a coherent, recognizable, and personally relevant story, a story that might take place in the natural world. The gaze that this image suggests is rather like the cinematic gaze, a relationship entered into by the cinematic viewer and the object viewed that may be characterized by mastery, desire, identification, or some combination thereof. The target view of this manuscript is a voyeur. She is simultaneously pulled into the image through identification and excluded from it by the image's hermetic naturalistic design and its medial otherness. Whereas the image in the 1256 manuscript works by association with the words of the text and medieval notions of world order, such as the 4 elements and the 4 seasons, and represents a mnemonic image derived from the memory arts, the youngest version of the image places the figure within a coherent narrative structure that is not presented in the poem. The image continues to elicit an emotional response, but that response changes from one of fear or aversion to one of empathy and identification, or perhaps even Schadenfreude. Both images, I would argue, are equally powerful, but in fundamentally different ways. What I've presented to you here in brief, and admittedly using only a single image in its several manifestations, are some of the questions that manuscript variation can raise. Here, questions about the viewer's presumed agency, the effect and function of the images, and how they might have worked in conjunction with the text. I've also explored here how artists might have engaged with developing ideas about vision. Contrary to the work of other scholars, such as Michael Camille and more recently Susan Akbari, this material complicates the idea that there was a clear development from one vision model to the other that is reflected in the visual arts and literature. But it does suggest that manuscript illustration in the Middle Ages was a dynamic area of experimentation and that images were more fluid than texts. Now, after I wrote this How I Think About Literature talk for you, in which I've tried to make my interest in manuscripts and their variation accessible to you through images, I realized that I hadn't really talked specifically about literature at all. Lest you think that I don't actually read the books that I work on, but only look at pictures, let me just add that the connection for me between the kind of visual material I've presented today in literature is through images. I'm interested in the creation of images in literary texts, whether they are pictorial images or verbal images, such as ekphrasis, description, exempla, or other narrative strategies, narrative forms designed to visualize and create the experience of imagined three-dimensional worlds. In sum, reading and listening to medieval literature is a sensual experience. Contributing to that experience is the medieval book itself. The material I've presented to you today is only accessible through viewing the manuscripts themselves, ideally by holding them in our hands, turning the book's noisy parchment pages, seeing the lively and intricate interplay of text and image, reading the idiosyncratic handwritten script, feeling the book's heft, and smelling its organic components. I think about literature through its medium, and particularly through its material documentation in text and image. Thank you.
Professor Starkey will be willing to answer questions.
No questions.
I'm sure there will be. There we go.
I have a question. So you said that one model to explain the movement would be through a change in the perception theory or the visual theory. Could be, for me, like immediately I thought of a shift in art and in vision in that sense. It seems to be moving also from a more expressionist, I know this is a misplaced term, to a much more symbolic or symbolizing.
Well, there's certainly a shift in styles in this period, but I don't think that can explain everything that's going on with this image, with the introduction of the banderole, with the loss of the allegory is present throughout this period. So a shift in styles doesn't really explain why we have an allegorical image at the beginning, and then later it gets translated into something that is more like an image of an actor in a scene. So yes, style plays a role. I'm not saying that models of vision are the only reason why this changes. I'm just trying to read these images through this discourse on visuality that is quite lively in this period as well, and see what new perspectives, what different perspectives that discourse might offer us on these images. Yeah, Amir.
Kathryn, how do you read these images in conjunction with, or perhaps you don't, with what's happening in visual arts and paintings around the same time?
Well, I really have focused on how they relate to the text, how they appear in manuscripts, what's the intersection between the illustrations and the text that they accompany. I have some art historical training, but I'm not an art historian, and I don't pretend to be. I'm really interested in how the manuscript functions as a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk with text and image together. So, yeah, I mean, you find this variation in style also in the visual arts at large, but I don't know of anything outside a manuscript, anything outside this kind of corpus of material where you actually have a specific cycle that's being reproduced over and over and over again for 250 years for a secular text. That's not a biblical text, that's not a religious text.
So you see it in a way as a commentary on the written, on the textual, or as an expansion?
Well, it's working in conjunction with the textual. These, the very first instantiation of this image is so closely related to the textual. It really visualizes the words in the text. And then in later versions, in other versions, the artists have taken more leeway. They've interpreted the text. They've provided new examples. Some of the images provide examples that are not present in the text, for example. They just show you another example of what's being described in the text. So the artists kind of take issue. They play off the text. They reproduce the text. They disagree with the text sometimes. So it really depends on the image. It depends on the manuscript. But within this cycle even, there is a lot of variation of relationships between the text and the image. Yeah?
So I look at this and I think it could support this kind of old-fashioned reading of like the development of literary history from like a didactic, you know, the text is just supposed to teach you and you're just supposed to learn, to a more interpretative model, you know, in the end where like meaning is more contingent and more loosely constructed. And I wonder if you think that that's true.
Well, it's not true with the case, with the text. If you look at the context in which the text appears in the earliest manuscript, it's a standalone text. And then by the 15th century, it's always included in compilation manuscripts with other didactic texts that are very clearly designed for didactic purpose. So that does not play into that. Adrian.
Yeah, I sort of following up on Michelle's question, I had this. I was wondering about the way the heading of the figures works in conjunction with the text that it accompanies. And I know next to nothing about illustrated manuscripts, so you have to forgive me if I'm asking something really stupid. But in two of them, I think it's the one from 1400 and the one from 1460. Sorry, the Unstete or the Unsteht is right underneath the word for
Unstetigkeit. Yeah.
If I'm reading that right.
Yeah.
Which it seems to be kind of there's a neat sort of visual pun going on there, right? Which, from with my 21st century eyes, that there's words are being repeated there. But these are also, of course, the ones where we're moving to, I would say, this sort of a more allegorical model. Is this something that just happens through the way these things are composed, or is there also some kind of new a new way of doing literature, a new way of doing illustration coming in there? Or is that just these two happen to be around the same time and Unstetigkeit happen to pop up at the beginning of the line?
Well, these two are marginal images, and this one as well. And this one, they're embedded in the text. Right, and in this passage, actually, there's Unstetigkeit is repeated a lot. So I'm not sure that it is significant. I would have to look back at the full passage again. But I think it is significant that this is Unstete and not Unstetigkeit, because Unstetigkeit existed as a concept, and that would be the term most commonly used for personifications rather than Unstete, which is adjectival. Matt?
Yeah, this is fascinating. It seems like you're mostly dealing here in your talk with two semiotic systems, the written word and the image. And I wonder if there's a connection to a third, which is bodily gesture. And whether these images are meant at all to reference or to educate the reader about appropriate bodily gestures.
There is a whole section in the text on bodily gestures, actually, that describe how you should comport yourself and so on. This, I mean, the gestures are, this is so fundamentally different from this. You know, it's obvious, it's pointing, she's pointing to herself, she's pointing to the text at the same time. There seems to be a connection created there between the figure and the text, and that has less to do with teaching you as a viewer to gesture properly. So I read the gestures in this one and in this one, and this one really is deictic gestures that are pointing toward the text and indicating that this passage in the text deals with this concept. There's, you know, in this period there is a lot of new methods of formatting also being introduced, and one of those is chapter headings and sort of indexing devices that allow you to find sections in manuscripts. And this manuscript is no exception. Right around 1340, actually, the manuscript is kind of redesigned to have a full index and a table of contents, and that then gets reproduced and added to over time. So I think the gestures for this figure are probably deictic gestures that are helping you to navigate the text.
I had a question.
Yeah.
This is kind of naive because I don't know anything about German context, but in Italy, a lot of the authors that I deal with connect images as the idea, the old idea that images are the Latin of the illiterate. And in defending vernacular literature. And I was wondering, do the images change alongside the status or authority of vernacular literature with respect to Latin? Because he was a cleric.
He was, yes.
And does it reflect, I guess, the change in audience as well? I mean, I'm just curious about the readership.
Yeah. So the manuscripts, the ones that we know about, were owned by a variety of patrons, a variety of people, ranging from archbishop to secular court to wealthy merchant. And that seems to have been the case kind of throughout the period in which it was being reproduced. The images suggest that people would have to have been able to read or have had access to the text in order to understand the images. So I don't see them pointing to any development in literacy so much, nor do I, and the only thing that points to a difference in audience is the fashion of the clothes, which is always made to mimic to the fashion of the audience. Yeah. Yes. Monica.
This is probably the naivest of all the naive questions. But I'm just curious about the fact that it switches to two male figures in the middle of the sequence. And so it seems to be, the first one seemed to be about inconstancy as being projected onto females, of course, and they have to be cut up in order to be monitored and so on. And then you've got these guys, and you can't help thinking that perhaps it's shifting. The woman over at the end seems more like a victim of inconstancies, and that is an extraordinarily snake-like, dragon-like thing.
Yeah.
She's kind of coming out of her. And so I'm just, I'm just wondering whether the story is changing about who's the victim of inconstancy and how you should see it.
Yeah. Gender in general in these manuscripts is really interesting because although one would...
That looks like a little kid.
Which one? This one?
1420.
Oh, a boy. Wow.
Maybe it's just short.
Man. That's right. Well, no, he's just pointing to it. It's not, he's just saying with inconstancy, so he may not be inconstant at all himself. Maybe. So the Latin tradition would suggest that with these abstract feminine nouns, they would be reproduced visually as female figures. But in fact, in this manuscript, that's not the case. Instead, across the board, if you look at all of the figures in all of the images, it's about 50 male, 50 female. And people have thought that that may be because the artist is creating a book for a courtly audience that was otherwise interested in looking at manuscript images of romances and so on, and having half male, half female figures would enable the artist to show interaction, which a courtly audience was very interested in. So that's one theory. It is really interesting when the gender shifts. And here, as you pointed out, it not only shifts, but you have a completely redesign of the figure. Part of me wants to read it as a development, but part of me, of course, resists that reading, in part because, you know, there's so much similarity between the first one and the last one that it kind of disallows that kind of a reading.
This one was quite different because she's not looking at you. She seems to be pathetic. She looks, you know, she's inciting either pity or sympathy.
Yeah, but what about this one? She's not.
No,
you know, and she's not divided, and she's gazing straight. She's a very powerful posture. She's pointing, right, she's being inconstant. Right?
Yes,
so,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, true, right.
So I thought a lot about the gender aspect of these manuscripts, and I couldn't come up with a kind of coherent reading of it that did not just interpret single images, that was sort of looked across the whole cycle. It just seems to be, there's so much variety that it's hard to come up with a consistent description of what's going on. Yeah, Gabrielle?
So I have to say, I've been kind of enjoying watching you gesture toward these images, kind of like the images themselves gesture toward the text, right? And also the way you're sort of shifting between talking about the text and talking about the image, right? Like this 1460 lady who sort of points in one direction and points in another. So there's something very sort of satisfying in the fact that this is the one that you chose to talk about. I'm wondering, in that light, is how did people get this text? Like, did they read it for themselves silently? Did they read it out loud? Was it read to them? Is there any way that we could maybe, I don't know if you would have this data, but if you could you know something about how the text was experienced between 1256 and the second half of the 15th century that might maybe shed light on this sort of frontal versus profile kind of image, sort of seeming rational?
Well, in the 1256 manuscript, there are divisions into books, and then there are thematic passages that are marked by these red initials. And other than that, there's no indication, there's no subdivision, there's no table of contents, there's no indexing. There are just the images that are placed more or less next to the passage that they illustrate. But that's it. So in order to read it, you would have to, and it's small, it's about this big, that one. So one presumes a single reader or a very small group of readers. The images are often turned on their sides, so you would have to, these ones are not, but you would have to turn the manuscript in order to look at the image. But the kind of reading could not involve looking up specific passages, looking up specific topics, unless you did it by way of the illustrations. The 1340 manuscript which is the next one. I didn't talk about that one in detail, but it's got a full index, and it is, where are we? Sorry. There. It's got a table of contents that is keyed to the text. So not only do you have the red initials, but there are also numbered chapter headings, and within the chapters there are numbered subsections of chapters, and within the subsections of chapters there are paragraphs that are marked by the red initial, and you can find all of these things indexed. And so it's been turned into a reference book. At that point, you can look up specific items in the index, and you can go and see what the book has to say about inconstancy or courtship or gift giving or whatever. And that indexing stays with the manuscript pretty much throughout. So it seems that at some point in these 100 years, it became something that would have been read and enjoyed and perhaps for entertainment and recited, to something that was a reference book. And that is supported by the fact that in these later manuscripts, it's incorporated into these compilation manuscripts with other didactic texts that also have indexes. So you can use it then as a real book, a learning book, and a book of edification to figure out how you're supposed to behave or how people did behave. I mean, it would have been archaic by that time. So it's also kind of looking back, like Emily Post. You know, how did people used to behave in those good old days? Andre.
I have one more, and it's maybe a little bit anachronistic, so that's my disclaimer. I have a question about the relation of the text and the image, and whether this could be described as some kind of process of growing autonomy of the image towards the text, so that the illustrator would have more, like in the later versions, he seems to have more freedom in his choice and the devices he uses, the way he makes his illustration. And would you consider the question of aesthetic autonomy a relevant one, so that the text is separate from the image, and that both media kind of develop different strength in the competition?
Well, they do from the start, because the person writing the text is not the same person doing the image. These are workshop productions. So they would be written by somebody. There would be somebody who would design the manuscript and would say what was going to be illustrated. The text would be written, and then it would go to the illustrator. And so some illustrators will follow directions and others wouldn't. Some would read the text and have a real understanding of what they were supposed to illustrate, and others would not. There are examples of romance manuscripts where the designer has written, two men fighting, two knights fighting, and the illustrator has drawn two knights fighting with shields that do not correspond to anything in the text, because his idea of two knights fighting had these shields, and that's just the way it was. And then you have other examples where clearly the illustrators read and known the text and picked them up. So that independence exists from the very beginning, actually. And so you get a lot of variation between what's going on in text and image. The unique thing about this corpus of material is that the scribe, the artist, had as a source book an older version of the manuscript. The images are so alike over time that you can tell that they were working from a source that contained the same images. The same things are always illustrated, even when there's this variation in the appearance of the image, and this one's quite extreme. You've still got the labeling. This is unstate, this is inconstancy that's being depicted here, and it's being depicted at this point in the text. So that's really quite rare.
Questions? Let us thank our speaker.
Thank you.